Center.
Thank you very much, Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to help move forward with second reading of the Public Sector and MPP Accountability and Transparency Act 2014. Monsieur le Président, je suis ravi de pouvoir contribuer à l'adoption de la deuxième lecture de la loi de 2014 sur la responsabilisation et la transparence du secteur public et des députés. Mr. Speaker, over the past few years, as all of us have, I've knocked on many doors and spoken to many constituents, and I heard from them about a range of issues and concerns. One of the issues that I heard from them frequently was the need for government to be accountable, for the need for government to be transparent, that we shepherd our tax dollars wisely, and that we ensure long-term financial sustainability as a government so that we can continue to provide the services that Ontarians have come to rely on, that the constituents of my riding of Etobicoke Centre have come to rely on. And that is why I'm so honored to be Parliamentary Assistant to Deb Matthews to work with her on just these issues, Mr. Speaker, on just these issues that my constituents raised. And that is why I am so honored to be here today to speak to this bill. This is a signature bill, Mr. Speaker. It's a signature bill for this government. It reflects our commitment to set the highest standards for accountability and transparency. And it demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, that this government has made it a priority to be more open and more accountable to the people that we serve. And this is all of these things, Mr. Speaker, are priorities that we take seriously. Il s'agit d'un projet de loi prioritaire pour notre gouvernement, Monsieur le Président. Il reflète notre engagement à établir des normes très élevées et en matière de responsabilisation et de transparence. Et il démontre que notre gouvernement a donné la priorité à une plus grande ouverture et responsabilité envers la population qu'il sert. Minister Matthews described some of the cornerstones of the proposed bill, including measures to rein in broader public sector senior executive compensation. It is my pleasure to outline the components of the bill that would, if passed, strengthen political accountability, modernize the reporting of lobbyist activity, and further strengthen our record-keeping obligations, and provide greater transparency in the classified agency and broader public sectors. Je vais maintenant vous présenter les grandes lignes du projet de loi. S'il est adopté, il augmentera la responsabilisation politique, modernisera les rapports sur les activités des lobbyistes, renforcera nos obligations de tenue de dossier et assurera une plus grande transparence dans le secteur des organismes classifiés et dans le secteur parapublic. Mr. Speaker, our government believes that openness begins with us. It begins with the members in this House, with our elected representatives. We who are elected into office, we need to lead by example. And that is why our government is proposing new measures that, if passed, would set a high standard and make Ontario a leader by legislating expense reporting for elected representatives. Monsieur le Président, notre gouvernement estime que la transparence commence au niveau des représentants élus. Nous qui sommes élus à nos fonctions devons montrer l'exemple. Et c'est pourquoi notre gouvernement propose de nouvelles mesures qui, si elles sont adoptées, établiront des normes élevées et feront de l'Ontario un chef de file en obligeant les représentants élus à rendre compte de leurs dépenses. The proposed bill, if passed, would make it mandatory for cabinet ministers, parliamentary assistants, opposition leaders, and their staff to post their expense information online. Currently, this expense reporting is done on a voluntary basis. Under the proposed bill, information on expenses claimed by cabinet ministers, parliamentary assistants, opposition leaders, and their staff would continue to be subject to a review process by the Integrity Commission, an officer of this Assembly. The Premier, our Cabinet, and staff have been complying with that spirit of transparency voluntarily since April 1st, 2010, Mr. Speaker, and by making online reporting a legislative requirement, we would ensure that the opposition would follow our lead. Mr. Speaker, our government's proposals to report expense information online do not just stop with cabinet ministers, parliamentary assistants, opposition leaders, and their staff. Under the proposed bill, online reporting of expense information would also extend to each and every one of the MPPs in this legislature. The bill, if passed, would require the Speaker to post online information on MPP expenses concerning out-of-riding travel, related hotel expenses, meals, and hospitality expenses. Mr. Speaker, our government believes that elected representatives need to lead by example. I think we can all agree, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Ontario deserve clear and easy access to the expenses of their elected representatives. Taking action to have greater accountability and transparency in expense reporting for elected representatives is one of the key anchors of this proposed legislation, Mr. Speaker. Our government believes that the people of Ontario have the right to know how their elected representatives are spending tax dollars to do the work that we are mandated to do. Now, Mr. Speaker, lobbying is also an essential part of a healthy democracy. Notre gouvernement comprend le rôle important que joue la transparence pour laisser savoir à la population ontarienne qui communique avec son gouvernement et dans quel objectif. Nous comprenons également qu'en renforçant la responsabilisation, nous améliorons l'information qui est communiquée au public. C'est pourquoi nous proposons de moderniser la loi de l'enregistrement des lobbyistes. Our government understands the important role transparency plays in letting the people of Ontario know who is communicating with their government and for what purpose. We also understand that strengthening accountability would help to improve the information that is provided to the public. That's why we're proposing to modernize Ontario's Lobbyist Registration Act. In our province, Mr. Speaker, the Integrity Commissioner also plays an important role as the registrar appointed under the Lobbyist Registration Act, and we value her contribution. The proposed amendments are a response to the registrar's recommendations. If passed, the proposed amendments would strengthen oversight and enforcement powers for the registrar and enhance transparency of the lobbyist registry. The proposed bill would give the registrar, Mr. Speaker, investigative powers and the ability to prohibit individuals from lobbying for up to 2 years if they are found to have violated the Act. It would also establish new rules for lobbyists. This includes prohibiting lobbyists from lobbying and providing paid advice on the same subject matter at the same time. It also includes establishing a single set of rules that apply to in-house lobbyists at both for-profit and non-profit organizations. Enforcement provisions would include stiffer fines. A fine of up to $25,000 for a first-time offense, and a fine of up to $100,000 for subsequent offenses. These amendments, Mr. Speaker, to the Lobbyist Registration Act are part of our continued effort to make government more open and accountable for the people of Ontario. Now, Mr. Speaker, another key component of our blueprint for enhanced accountability and transparency is our proposed reforms on record keeping. Our government takes record keeping obligations very seriously. The Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner has credited our government for implementing important record-keeping reforms and staff training. And to date, we've acted on all of the non-legislative recommendations. With this proposed bill, we're going further. We're taking further action. Monsieur le Président, notre plan d'amélioration de la responsabilisation et de la transparence comprend un autre aspect majeur, un projet de réforme des obligations en matière de tenue des dossiers. Notre gouvernement octroie une importance capitale à ces obligations en matière de tenue des dossiers. Le Bureau du commissaire à l'information et à la protection de la vie privée de l'Ontario a remercié notre gouvernement d'avoir mis en œuvre des réformes en matière de tenue des dossiers et de la formation du personnel. À ce jour, nous avons donné suite à toutes les recommandations de nature non législative. Avec notre projet de loi, nous franchissons une autre étape. This legislation would, if passed, take the next steps by acting on 3 of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner's recommended legislative amendments to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, known as FIPA, and the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, known as MFIPA. The proposed bill would require all institutions subject to FIPA and MFIPA to ensure that measures are in place to preserve records, Mr. Speaker, to prohibit the willful destruction of records with the intent to deny someone the right to access records, Mr. Speaker, and to introduce a fine of up to $5,000 for the willful destruction of records. Mr. Speaker, our government consulted with the acting commissioner and his office about the recommendations to assist us in the development of this legislation. We wanted to ensure that we were properly addressing the 3 specific legislative recommendations. Now, members may ask, why are we not proposing an amendment with respect to the recommendation to legislatively require the duty to document all key decisions within government? Currently, there is no legislative duty to document in either freedom of information or record-keeping legislation in any other jurisdiction in Canada. That said, our government is attentive to this and is going to be proactive, and it has been proactive. We've had discussions with the acting commissioner about this and are discussing this further with other Canadian jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker. Regardless of how we proceed on this front, our recent and ongoing training on records management for staff continues to emphasize the need to manage and create public records in order to document key government decisions, activities, and operations. The other thing I should mention is that all major policy decisions are always documented through meeting minutes, briefing notes, management board and treasury board notes, as well as cabinet minutes. Mr. Speaker, our government has listened to the recommendations of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner regarding the establishment of the offence provision related to the willful destruction of public records. The proposed offence provision is in line with similar offence provision in 7 other Canadian jurisdictions, including the federal government. If our legislation passes, the establishment of the proposed offence provision would send a clear signal about how organizations and individuals subject to this legislation must manage their records. And it also the consequences that would flow from the improper destruction of records with the intent to avoid access to information requests. Mr. Speaker, we are also proposing a longer limitation period in connection with the new records destruction offence provision in FIPA and MFIPA. Currently, the limitation period for many provincial offences is actually 6 months. And this means that a prosecution cannot take place 6 months after an offence has been committed. So we recognize that the willful destruction of records may not be discovered within that time frame. And so accordingly, we've proposed extending the time period for the prosecution of this new offence 2 years after the commission of the offence is first discovered. So under this legislation, if passed, a prosecution for this offence would require the consent of the Attorney General. Monsieur le Président, le projet de loi 8 mise sur les efforts en vue d'instaurer une plus grande transparence dans le secteur parapublic et de rendre le gouvernement plus accessible pour toute la population ontarienne. Des changements proposés à la loi sur la responsabilisation du secteur parapublic exigeront, s'ils sont adoptés, que les organismes désignés affichent leurs plans d'activité et autres documents financiers ou officiels précisés. Mr. Speaker, another component of this Bill 8 would also be to build on the efforts to bring greater transparency to the broader public sector and help us make government more accessible for all Ontarians. Proposed changes to the broader Public Sector Accountability Act would, if passed, require designated organizations to post their business plans and other specified business or financial documents. The legislation would give Management Board of Cabinet the authority to issue a directive outlining the specific requirements. Mr. Speaker, many broader public sector organizations already post their business plans. These proposed changes would make this practice into a mandatory requirement for all and would apply to organizations already designated under the Act, including hospitals, school boards, publicly assisted universities and colleges of applied arts and technology, children's aid societies, community care centers, and organizations that received $10 million or more in public funding from the government in the previous fiscal year. Monsieur le Président, le commissaire à l'intégrité a également un rôle à jouer dans la promotion de la transparence et de la responsabilisation lorsqu'il examine les dépenses. Le commissaire à l'intégrité examine les dépenses des ministres, des adjoints parlementaires, des chefs de l'opposition et de leur personnel en vertu du pouvoir que lui confère la loi sur l'examen des dépenses des ministres et des chefs d'un parti de l'opposition et l'obligation de rendre compte. Si cette loi est adoptée, nos modifications proposées à cette loi exigeront que ces dépenses soient affichées en ligne. L'affichage ne serait plus une pratique exemplaire volontaire, ce serait une exigence législative obligatoire. Mr. Speaker, the Integrity Commissioner plays a role in promoting transparency and accountability when it comes to reviewing expenses. The Integrity Commissioner reviews the expenses of cabinet ministers, parliamentary assistants, opposition leaders, and their staff under the authority of the Cabinet Ministers and Opposition Leaders' Expenses Review and Accountability Act. If passed, our proposed amendments to that act would require that these expenses be posted online. This would no longer be a voluntary best practice, it would be a mandatory legislative requirement. Since the Public Sector Expenses Review Act came into force in 2009, the Integrity Commissioner has also been reviewing the expenses of 17 classified agencies and 4 hydro organizations, the public entities currently prescribed in regulation. This review process ensures that these organizations are complying with the Travel, Meal, and Hospitality Expenses Directive. And this is demonstrating a responsible use of public funds. Our proposed legislation would, if passed, provide the Integrity Commissioner with the ability to select which organizations she would review. The government intends to include all 196 classified agencies through a regulatory change. The Integrity Commissioner would then have the ability to select, in a given time period, Which of these organizations would be required to submit expenses for review? These proposed changes are based on recommendations from the Integrity Commissioner. And I know these changes would, if passed, help to promote transparency and accountability across all classified agencies and hydro organizations. Monsieur le Président, la loi de 2014 sur la responsabilisation et la transparence du secteur public et des députés nous aidera à relever la barre au sein du gouvernement et dans le secteur parapublic. Cette loi complète établira des normes élevées pour nous tous et contribuera à instaurer le gouvernement transparent, ouvert et accessible que mérite la population de l'Ontario qui travaille dur. Mr. Speaker, when I opened, I shared with you how my constituents look for government to be transparent and accountable. I told you that I'm honored to be working with Minister Deb Matthews on this, and I am. And I told you that I'm honored to stand here to speak to this bill, and I am. I am honored because the proposed Public Sector and MPP Accountability and Transparency Act will help us raise the bar in government and the broader public sector. This legislation will set a high standard for us all, and it will help build the transparent, open, and accessible government the hardworking of people have asked for, and the transparent, open, and accessible government the hardworking people of Ontario deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.